I'm going to call this meeting to order. This is the City Council of Holyoke's Finance Subcommittee. My name is Joe McGivern. I am the chair. To my right is Mike Sullivan, City Councilor at Large. To my immediate left is Jim Leahy, City Councilor at Large, followed by Peter Tallman, City Councilor at Large. We are joined by Terry Murphy, who is our current Ward 2 Councilor, and by Linda Bacon, who represents Ward 5. We have a number of guests this evening, and we're here for the purpose of one order, and the purpose of this evening is going to be a fact-finding mission. We're looking for as much information as we can go on the topic. I suggest to all city councilors that tonight is not a night for debate or opinions, but rather for questions and looking for answers, and answers that we can't get tonight, we'll certainly look to get them in the near future. With that in mind, I will just read the order. There's a second meeting following us, the Charter and Rules, with a topic that's somewhat related to why we're doing this so close together. Terry Murphy is the chair. That's scheduled to start at 7 o'clock, and I promised the chair of the Charter and Rules that the Finance Committee will be done before 7 o'clock, unless our chairman of the Retirement Board, Jack McCarthy, does too much talking. The order on the agenda is the only order introduced by Councilor Sullivan that the Retirement Board, Mayor, Treasurer, Auditor, and Bond Counsel, along with the Manager of the Gas and Electric, be invited to a meeting of the Finance Committee to discuss the merits, feasibility of a pension obligation bond annual cash flow savings to the City of Holyoke, which could exceed $5 million. Chair will entertain a motion to take up. Motion made and seconded to take off the table for discussion. Thank you. Please, anyone who is making a presentation, your choice, come in, grab some seats. If you prefer to stay out in the audience, the larger mic is also available. We're going to begin with a presentation both by our, I don't know, what do we call you, Bellamy, now? You know, the former longtime acting auditor, or our savior and fill-in. And I think, Senator, you've been in the city of Holyoke more this past year than you haven't since 1973. And we welcome Senator McNary, to our known as Bond Counsel, but known as one of the finest financial advisors the city of Holyoke has had, and that's proven over for many years. Joining us is the president of the city council, also a member of this committee, Todd McGee. Good.
Beer guys outside, Joe.
Yes, there is a fundraiser, unbeknownst to most of us, going on upstairs, and we'll stop there. So far, there's no noise. I hope it keeps that way. Thanks. And Bellamy, do you have any extra copies? If anybody in the audience
I have plenty
needs
more.
one?
I think most people have one, but I've got plenty more.
Okay. And we'll take a few extra for some city councilors will be coming in as we're going. Told me they'd be a little late because of their work commitments, but they will be here. Thank you. Well, Mike Sullivan is the maker of the order. He's going to waive his introduction, and I think it speaks for itself. Mike is an advocate of the middle school projects, but like all of us, concerns about ways to pay for projects like this. But Bellamy, if you want to lead us, Senator.
Mike came to a member of the retirement board and asked us to come to this meeting. As I understand it, what you all would like is an education on pension obligation bonds, which was a topic that the retirement board was also interested in. So this has been a very good exercise for us as well to do a deep dive into POBs. Fortunately, we have a Cinder with access to a lot of information about pension obligation bonds. She came up with at least 150 pages of articles from learned journals and textbooks and so forth. So we went through all of that to try to put together for you a primer on pension obligation bonds, which really answers 4 questions. What are pension obligation bonds? Sort of what's their history and what's their history in Massachusetts? what are the pros and cons of pension obligation bonds, and finally, what are the approval requirements to make something like this happen in Massachusetts? Sure, help yourself. I don't know that I need to go through this page by page. I'm looking to you guys for direction. It's somewhat,
Just a summary, I suppose.
you want to summarize each page? Sure.
No, not of each page, maybe a
Just the whole
summary of
thing.
an overview of it. Like
All right,
executive
all right.
briefing.
All right, let's just go through it.
Just,
So-
Bellamy, if you
so-
keep in mind, most city councilors, including myself, are not up to date on
Okay,
pension
fine,
obligation
fine,
bonds. We don't
fine.
need the,
So let's start-
the
let's start
full
with-
version, but
Then
enough to give us.
let's start with the pension fund,
Okay,
which at the moment, in order to pay off all of the obligations to all of the pensioners now existing, needs about $420 million. The number is here somewhere. It needs $418 million. Now, of that, this is to pay off everybody over time, every current employee, every current pensioner. So over time, we would need $418 million to pay off that debt. We have $283 million cash on hand that we invest, and just to pat our backs, we've invested very well over the last 5 years. We're one of the top investment earners in the state of Massachusetts. So the idea of pension obligation bonds is to raise enough money to pay off the difference between the amount we have and the total amount we need, which in our case is $139 million. So what happens is a municipality like Holyoke would borrow $139 million and give it to the pension, the retirement fund, and the retirement fund would have all the money it needs to pay all of its pension obligations. That in turn would reduce the budgetary obligation of the city to pay on an annual basis for the, quote, unfunded, its share of the unfunded liability. Is that clear? I want to make, okay. So that's the idea behind a pension obligation bond. You know, they started in 1985. There have been billions issued since then. Only 3 in Massachusetts, Worcester, Dragut, and Brockton, and there are examples of that at the end of the presentation. We've talked about, on page 4, we've talked about the borrowing opportunity for Holyoke. And you'll note we show the unfunded liability that the city pays for every year to pay off that unfunded liability. $14 million in 2019, it's going to go up to 14.2 in 2022, 14.7 in 2023. This is according to an amortization schedule that is updated and changed every 2 years when we do an update of the value of the system. And here, when I say Holyoke, I'm talking about the city plus HG&E plus the housing authority and sewer and water. There's a smaller portion that goes in the city budget itself, but that is the total liability. Now, what's the rationale for issuing these bonds? And that is simply that we can earn a lot more on the funds in the pension fund than we would have to pay for the interest to borrow the money. Our pension fund is currently earning about 7.5% a year on the $283 million that we have. If we were to borrow, in other words, to bond and borrow money to add to that total, we'd only pay 5%. And that was a sort of a generous estimate that Cinder came up with. So the 2.5% spread is the quote savings or the benefit to the city. And that's the rationale, assuming that we can make that happen. But that is the rationale for pension obligation bonds. Now, there are a lot of other benefits which are on page 6. You know, it is a benefit to have the pension fully funded. We don't have to worry about the vicissitudes. You know, we can get the savings I talked about before if the returns come out as we hoped. If the city were to have $400 million to invest instead of 283, we might get access to some investment vehicles that we currently don't have access to because the investor requires a $50 million investment instead of a $10 million investment. or we might get access to lower rates, lower fees from the investment advisors because we're giving them more money. So there could be some economies. And finally, there was a study on pension obligation bonds in 2014 that said over time, the cities that use pension obligations had a favorable return of 1.5% over that period of time, over a benefit of 1.5%.
So, can I stop you there
So
for a
Mike,
minute?
yeah, sure.
Okay. So, I reached out to these people that did that survey, all right? And I believe this was the same one, the Boston College Group?
I don't
Looks
remember
like,
which
it looks
one
like
it was.
exactly
Yeah.
the same time frame and numbers.
It could be. I don't remember which one it was.
Alicia Monell. Right. And I asked them, and I've asked them twice now to get back to me. These numbers are 5 years old,
Right.
and the market is done, even though this snapshots that recovery, and I don't want to get into market timing, because I think we all agree only fools think they can time markets. But if we took that same, they're giving us 5-year-old data. If we took that same snapshot today, I think that number would be a lot better than what's being presented here, than that 1.5%.
It would if you just look at the last 5 years, yes. It would also look better over the extended period of time that includes the recession.
And I've asked
But
them to
either
tell
way,
me
it would
that
be
number, and they either refuse to because it counters everything they've put out in their studies, or they just don't want to be bothered doing the work anymore.
They just haven't done the work.
Okay, but,
But it is time for them to update it since that's 5 years old. I agree with you.
all right.
They should.
So we can all agree that this 1.5% is a extremely, extremely outdated and conservative number. Okay,
Agreed.
all right.
All right, let's turn to page 7, which are the risks. We've talked about the benefits. Let's look at the risks. The first is a financial risk that you may not have the returns that you expect. The second is a market risk because, we're talking about investing in the market and there are all sorts of market fluctuations that can affect things positively and negatively. There's a timing risk because the more money that you put in the market, the larger the risk that you're gonna lose money on a larger amount of money. A default risk. There's default. One can default on bonds. Wait a minute. Do I have this backwards? One can default one can default on bonds, but you can't default on a budgetary obligation, which is what we have now, which is similar to the next point, which is, our bond indebtedness is fixed. It's a fixed amount over every year over time, whereas the pension obligation schedules change, in our case, every 2 years as we update the actuarial view of what's going on.
So, it's just that I function better this way.
Yeah, no, that's
To
fine.
Save all the questions at the end.
That's the way I prefer to do it anyway. Let's
right.
get the questions done as we go.
So, we talk about timing risk and how much money you have in. If this was 20 years from now,
Yes,
and the pension was fully funded
yes,
20 years from now, we'd be at the same risk 20 years from now because we have all the money in one pot.
correct. We would have a risk, yes. There would be a risk. There's a market, yeah, there's a.
So by putting
a lot, well, but not all of these risks. You'll have fewer risks, but you will have risk, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, so, but what I'm saying is, by funding it 100% now, we're at no greater risk of that being affected by a downturn in the market than we would be 20 years from now.
That's your job.
You should push the green button. Mic on.
Yep, there's a button to push. It'll light up a green light. This big, right, that's it.
You'd actually be at greater risk if you fund the unfunded pension liability. You've got that much more money earning less return. And the other thing is that you don't get, so right now you're on an amortization schedule to fund the existing unfunded pension liability, and I believe you're funding it through 2032. If, in fact, you didn't make the assumed rate of return as you update your unfunded pension liability, you would have new unfunded pension liability in addition to what you just funded, and you'd have to start amortizing that concurrent with amortizing the debt service on the pension obligation bonds. So you could, all of a sudden, it would impact how much you have to come up with each year. And that's the risk that, from my perspective, and I worked on the Brockton pension obligation bond. We did $100 million for them, and that's the risk that I think Holyoke needs to evaluate. What resources does the city have to weather a downturn? Because you can't just structure the savings up front. It gets more complicated, and I don't want to stop from the presentation here, but it gets more complicated. You do have legislation, but the legislation is limited in terms of how it would allow you to structure the debt. And the state would probably intercede. The legislation requires state approval of any pension obligation bond that the city would issue, and the state probably would intercede and not allow savings to be taken up front, even if they would allow a pension obligation bond, because they'd want to see the city amass a certain amount of savings in order to buffer a downturn right out the gate, which has happened with both Worcester and Brockton, and they didn't have resources. I mean, Brockton had financial plan that was fairly elaborate, but their financial plan included, first off, no savings for 5 years, and also they were a willingness on the part of the administration to do a debt exclusion to the extent that they needed to fund it rather than to sort of tap into reserve position. But the city would have to develop an elaborate plan that worked for the city without compromising its credit.
Okay, so a debt exclusion if there was a downturn in the market.
Right.
If.
But in the meantime, a plan that makes sense, that doesn't just destroy the city's credit. One of the things we did with Brockton that I thought was very interesting, which Holyoke would need to do, we took a look at different iterations. Success out the gate with a market that returned greater returns than the rate on the bonds. But then we looked at what would happen if there were losses and simultaneous need to fund more unfunded pension liability and losses right out the gate, and what kind of an impact would that be on the community. So I think that would be, that kind of analysis would have to be looked at, because the city can't just assume that everything's going to work out just fine. You know what I mean?
I totally agree with that, but what
Yeah.
I'm getting at there is, if we're contemplating a debt exclusion now,
Yep.
guaranteed is the only way to fund the schools, right? Whereas if we were to have the debt exclusion as our backup, we'd have the money to fund the schools through this pension, the savings in this pension obligation bond, and we had the debt exclusion on the side if the market took a downturn to support the.
I can guarantee you that probably would result in, I think it would compromise the city's credit to have that be the plan. I don't think the state would even buy into that plan. Because, so for example, I mean, that sounds a lot like what state of New Jersey did, where they borrowed $3 billion. And I mean, they issued $3 billion of pension funds, and they did it, they took the savings and they used it to balance the budget. I mean, that's essentially what you'd be doing. You'd be wanting to use pension obligation bond savings to pay the debt service, which is normally a part of the budget, whether it's inside or outside Prop 2.5, and relying on something that's not real to fund the debt. And then there's absolutely no reason to think that anybody in the city would do a debt exclusion. I mean, I think that from my perspective, it's a mistake to combine the pension obligation bond potential opportunity with the need for debt exclusion for the schools. I think it's a mistake to think that's the funding source for, I mean, you've got an awful lot of unfunded OPEB liability. There's no plan to fund that right now either. I mean, some thinking with regard to if you have success with the pension and you can fully fund pension, then it provides opportunity to start funding OPEB at a rate that's a real plan, because right now there's not really a real plan to fund pension OPEB until pension is amortized. And one of the points that Bellamy said is, you've only got 13 years between now and 2032 when the pension system is supposedly fully funded, but the annual cost goes from $14 million up to $19 million according to the existing schedule before it's funded on an annual basis. And the idea of, you know, it would, I think that Brockton's perspective, and I think that it came out of, it took us a year to put that Brockton deal together, and it was working with the actuary and with the state and with state administration and finance to understand who thought what and what made sense. We worked with bond counsel, we worked, you know, we looked at iterations with the actuary. We must have looked at 100 different iterations that the state wanted to see. You know, what happens if you do this or do that? And they had $150 million of unfunded pension liability at the time. They only funded $100 million, the part that related just to the city. And their plan was not to take any money out. It was to leave it with this. It wasn't to give it, to provide more retirement benefits, but it was to leave it for purposes until they had, I mean, once, you don't know whether or not you're going to have success until 13 years has passed by. You know, you might have success in year 1 or 2, or years 4 and 5, but you need 13 years of success to generate whatever the savings is that can potentially come out of this. And, you know, the good news is that it's only, supposedly, it's only 13 years. I mean, there's a lot of thinking. If there's bad results in the next 13 years, and right now, you know, rates are low, but it's a good time to borrow. But the stock market, you know, at some point, there's an expectation that there will be another recession. And that's going to happen in the next 13 years, supposedly. You know, nobody's got a crystal ball, but you would have to make up what's going on within this same 13-year period if there's losses. So it's not a lot of time to make up losses. I think there's a concern at the state level already as to whether or not you know, you probably would end up extending the term out past 2032. You know, you don't have to do it until 2040, but you start to extend it out, which increases the amount of the unfunded pension liability as you stretch it out, the amortization. So I think, you know, I focus a lot on what the risk is because I think that it's important to evaluate exactly what the risk is and that people understand that, because that would be the conversation with the state. But, and I think that Holyoke's got limited resources. And I think the pension obligation bond needs to stand on its own, and the school bond should stand on its own. What is the best way to fund the school? Whether it's to spread it all out and do it in different tranches, you know, or take advantage of current rates. We did, you know, I think I was asked to have a discussion about that at this early part of the city council meeting. Yep. And we did bring a lot of iterations. We were asked to provide a lot of different numbers on different options, and we did bring all that, and it's quite enlightening. But I think that the pension obligation bond has its own set of risks that need to be evaluated. I don't know that the state would even consider letting the city assume it could take any savings out of what got produced. And the structure that would, so if you look at the special legislation, it requires that the most leeway you have with regard to the structure is level debt service, like a mortgage bond structure. You can't have ascending debt service, which is what you need to do with the bond in order to produce savings up front versus what you have to pay. So you'd have to get special permission somehow. I mean, there are certain ways you could do that with more special legislation or with State Qualified Bond Act, but you know, it's a long process to evaluate this. Hopefully, you know, rates would stay low. You'd see what, you know, if the city wants to evaluate it, there's a lot of work to be done to do that.
So when you say a lot of work, what kind of a time frame are you talking? 6 months, a year?
It took
8?
Brockton a year, and they had a lot of expert in-house and expert in-house people who were willing to, you know, focus on it a lot, give it a lot of time, and then they also had their actuary was willing to run a lot of different sets of numbers to show the state what would happen, because the state was skeptical. I mean, the state basically has only used Worcester and Brockton as guinea pigs so far to see what they think.
So what I'm hearing is our city is one of the top earners in the state.
Yep.
How is Brockton and Worcester doing with their
Pension obligation bond? Well, one of the requirements
not with
with the return.
Right.
Well, one of the requirements was that they had to put the money in the state system. So they put the money in PRIT, and the state manages the money.
And
so,
we're doing better than PRIT.
And you're doing better than PRIT, but I would assume so I think they only had to put I don't think they had to put all their retirement system assets. They had to put the proceeds of the bonds. So if you issued, you know, if the city's unfunded, I'm not sure what the city's unfunded pension liability is as a share of the total unfunded. If the city, so Brockton purposely didn't do
32%.
32%.
The unfunded liability is 32% of the total, roughly.
For the city, just
for
the
the
city,
city, yeah.
not the different housing authority or the
Oh, no,
electric rate.
the total, sorry, the total
Okay,
package
so is
of
it
Holyoke's.
50
So it's,
million?
no, it's
Or 40 million?
130,
Oh, so the 118 million, yeah.
yeah, 128 million out of 400, or whatever.
But that's the aggregate, includes the electric rate,
Right.
includes, yeah. So they didn't,
This says it's 68% funded.
Yeah, so it's 32% unfunded, yeah.
right, so it's 118 million of unfunded pension liability. Well, in Brockton's case, it was 150. But that included their housing authority, their other enterprise activities. They didn't want to deal with that. They just did the city component, which was 100 million.
There's an asterisk here. It says
They
the
left the
city
rest.
equals the gas and electric, the
it's-
housing, sewer, and the water.
Right, and in their case, they only did, one of the things they didn't want to do was become overfunded. I mean, then you get into a discussion and argument with, with employees and everybody else about, well, now you're overfunded, you can afford doing this and do that and do everything else. You can do COLAs, you can do whatever else because you're overfunded. Instead of, it's a defined benefit as opposed to, it gets into that whole discussion. So they didn't want to become overfunded, and they're not overfunded. That's not, they're not sorry they did it, but they haven't seen the advantage yet. Their bonds go out for many more years. They lost 25% in what happened with the 2007, 2008 recession. I think they did it in 2005, so almost 2 years out the gate.
Did Brockton and Worcester, did the credit rating go down, both of them?
Brockton's didn't, but the rating agencies subsequent to the recession have changed their thinking on things. So, I mean, that's definitely, before it used to be, because I think some of the first, it used to be you could do pension obligation bonds before 1986 as tax exempt. And with the Tax Reform Act of 1985, which went into effect January 1, it had to be taxable because it's basically an arbitrage play. So the federal government didn't want you issuing tax exempt bonds and investing in taxable investments, equities, at the expense, so-called expense of the federal government. So it's taxable, but taxable rates are, they were low in 2005. They're low now. And so that's why it's a good time to think about it, but it takes a lot of work to look at it and evaluate it.
But this is circling kind of back to the original thing I mentioned. They lost a lot out of the starting gate in 2008, and the question I haven't been able to get anybody to give me an answer to is, where are they now in 2019? Over the long term, because we all agree there's going to be a recession. But for every recession, there's also a recovery.
Right.
And if you can draw the line from wherever you want back to the start of the stock market.
I think they're only break even at this point.
They got up to 58% by 2015, it's on page 13, but I don't have a number since then.
Right, we
would-
don't have any numbers for 4 years.
No, but we work with the city of Brockton. I was just with them today at a different meeting at the state. I think, and I've asked them where they stand. I think that they basically are about where they were in the first place. They're not sorry because they've got a lot of experience still to, a lot of years still to experience. And they didn't go into it thinking that they would do anything other than have it serve the pension system. They, and if there was leftover, it was going to serve. They had a plan. It wasn't, and it's a written plan. I'm sure it's a public document. It was this thick of showing all of the iterations, all of the work. The process would be, first off, to run numbers. I'm not sure where the $5 million number came from, who gave that number, but so the first thing they did was they started running numbers enough to go and meet with the state and show them what they had. I think the jury is out whether or not the state would even approve any of these. I think there's been a couple other cities, maybe 2 or 3, and some of them that are coming from a place of not having enough wherewithal, and they want this, they're thinking that this is an opportunity, but it's just a lot of risk. So I think that after you meet with the state, then they start a preliminary discussion of what they want. I mean, the original, this is a different set of A&F people at this point, a different governor. But originally, when Brockton did it, they had a whole set of requirements. If you were less than AAA, you couldn't have any savings for 5 years. If you were, you couldn't even have it be structured to produce savings. I mean, one of the things that we learned in hindsight was that it's important to have savings to buffer losses. I mean, you want to generate savings up front, but like I just said, the legislation that Holyoke has doesn't allow the production of a lot of savings up front. So the city would need, without more legislation or without some other kind of relief, the city would need to come up with its own resources. I mean, it's got a stabilization fund, but that would be a terrible thing if that got raided. That would, and you'd have to rate it because it's debt. You'd have to pay the debt. You can't hope that you get a debt exclusion to pay the debt. You'd have to rate it or cut. And it makes you extremely vulnerable position. But then after we did iterations, they kept on coming back wanting more and more iterations, and the actuary was willing to keep running numbers. And, it was close to a year later, we had to put together on paper the exact plan, what the city was going to do with it. And, it was a bit of a guinea pig. I'm not sure how much they're willing to do more guinea pigs in the state. One of the positions of the state in the last year and under this new administration is to pay close attention to any community that's got any kind of fiscal problem and to get in there. If there's a deficit, the state is in there running things at this point. So, you really have to get your ducks in line and evaluate things. One of the things, if you do end up deferring principal in order to produce savings up front, is that deferral of principal means you're paying debt service on more bonds longer that aren't being paid down because you're pushing off paying it down in order to have savings up front. So that cuts into whatever savings might get produced. But, I agree interest rates are probably pretty good, and would not be a long bond. But there's a tremendous amount of risk, and the rating agencies have a different perspective. They used to have let's just wait and see. Now it's a little bit different. I think that it could compromise the city's credit, and that would need to be evaluated before you just did it, especially if you're thinking of issuing 20 or 30, $50 million worth of bonds for school construction, either simultaneous or afterwards or whatever. So those are just some context to think about this.
Hey, Bellamy, is there additional risks or additional things
No,
in the presentation?
Let's move on. Let's move on to page 8 and just talk about, because there's some more points to be made, which talks about timing, because that to me is one of the most important things about pension obligation bonds. And this just says that, some bonds have done well, some haven't done well, but success seems to be dependent on the point in the business cycle when the pension obligation bond is issued. And that is made visually clear on page 9, which says that the best time to issue a pension obligation bond is, slightly after the bottom of the economic cycle. Unfortunately, we are at the top of the economic cycle, such that the expectation out there is that there is going to be a correction of some sort sometime in the near term. So to move from just giving you facts to giving you opinion, it is the opinion of the retirement board and our investment advisor that this is absolutely the wrong time to do pension obligation bonds. We like the idea of pension obligation bonds, but we don't like them in 2019 or 20, which is about when it would happen, given the year it takes to get the approval. And I will, just to back that up, I will state that 8 months ago, the treasurer and I met with Tim Flynn, who manages your stabilization fund, and he swore to us that his prediction was that the contraction was going to be in the middle of 2019. Now, that hasn't happened. But last week, Goldman Sachs came out and said their new projection is that the economy is going to make it through 2020 next year, and then and things could weaken after that. So there seems to be general consensus out there that something's going to happen because the recovery's been so long. It's been 11 years now. So, I just want to preface that saying that was opinion, not facts. All these other things we talked about were facts. Page 10 just goes through all the different steps and approvals that are necessary. Happily, we already have certain legislation enacted by the City Council in 1998 that allows us to start the process, but it still must be approved by the State Office of Administration of Finance and Finance. Unfortunately, PARAC doesn't like pension obligation bonds, so they will speak against it. There's also a federal association that doesn't like it, so it'll be an uphill battle, let's put it that way. Is that fair? And will take, as we said earlier, at least a year to do.
And I think, if I heard Cinder correctly, If we were to get state approval, or if we were to get through these hoops, they would also want to take over some of the funds themselves, which we, as a municipality, as a retirement board, have been fighting for some time now.
I think you'd have to continue that. That would be, I think, a fight. That was part of that was one of the conditions.
Any idea what percentage? Or was it, you said it wasn't the whole thing, but,
I think it was the proceeds of the pension obligation bonds.
oh, okay.
That
No,
100 million.
just the extra money,
I
yeah.
think just that extra money. I'd just point out that when, I think that New Jersey, I mean, at one point, New Jersey was a AAA and the pension, it's now one of the lower rated states in the country. And issuing that pension obligation bond and taking the savings up front, which they did, and using it to balance the budget was a big, the beginning of what really undermined their credit. And that was, I mean, that was a derelict thing to do. And that's not the way that anybody, I mean, that's what's been done with a number of the pension obligation bonds that have been issued around the country, is to use it to balance something, and then all of a sudden you don't have, you don't have any more savings, and you're stuck with the remains.
Okay.
Page 13, or page 11, sorry. The first point is really what Cinder's already said, is the state may require that initial savings be set aside for a number of years as a hedge against whether or not you're going to make your assumptions, as opposed to allowing the city to just go ahead and spend those savings.
And I think the city would want to do, I mean, I would think the city should want to do that too. I mean, I think that you can't have if your stabilization fund were to get hit, then that undermines a lot of things. But it would definitely take down the rating with it. So I think the city would have to decide how many years do we, what's the amount that we need to amass? Because how much can we generate in savings? And if we do, how much should we have set aside? I mean, that's something that would have to be looked at carefully to make sure that you feel protected.
So why would we just do the HG&E portion of the unfunded liability?
No, I was saying you would just do the city side, not the HG&E. You could do HG&E, but you could do all of this.
We identified that as an option, that maybe you want to try with just H&E, because H&E has their own money,
Yeah.
and if there's a default, they can afford to pay for it. I'm sorry, Jim, but, and I know Jim's very much in favor of this, because we talked about this last fall, and we both were, but if we took out the bonds and there was a failure, you could require contractually that they make up the losses if they're willing to take that risk. How you do that contractually, I don't know, but that was the
I did
idea.
check into that a little bit. I think that, so the HG&E doesn't have their own authority to issue pension obligation bonds. The city would have to do it, but, and the city would have to look at how it protects itself there too with its credit, because you use your general obligation credit to do a pension obligation bond. That's how it's done. It's not a revenue bond. It's a general obligation bond. And this can't be a revenue bond because there are no revenues. There's no proof of any revenues when you do it. So you have to use your GO credit. And you'd be putting your GO credit out for the gas and electric department. You'd probably want to share in it, but you'd also probably want them to, you want to share in the profits, but you want them to take all the risk. Are you on the gas and electric? Yes, you are. So, but then the gas and electric department could potentially, it's the same discussion we're having, they could potentially benefit. They might have more resources. It's not clear to me what the rate setting, how that might filter through to the commissions that regulate the rates of the gas and electric department, that regulate electric rates and everything else. So that would have to be explored. But at first glance, checking with bond counsel, they seem to think that might be a possibility to just do their share. If that was something that was, you also could do any portion of a pension, unfunded pension obligation. You could do 10 million. You don't have to do 100 million. You don't have to do 118 million. You could do 10 million. But it's the same laborious effort. Less potential opportunity and less risk with something like 10 million. I mean, it might not be worth, I'm just saying that it could be any amount that you looked at. But like Bellamy said, it takes a lot of evaluation and a lot of the city wants to do its own diligence, make sure it does its own diligence on on the whole matter, and it's involved. And that has to be put on paper, because the city would also have to authorize pension obligation bonds. So you've got the legislation that provides you the enabling authority to issue pension obligation bonds, but you don't have a loan order that says that you, I think actually you might have authorized, did the city authorize 50 million at one point? Does that ring a bell? Back in a long time ago. I don't even know if that's lapsed or if that's, I don't think we're even carrying that on our records of what the city might have.
Jack, can you help us with that?
Joe might know.
No? It's a history question.
History? Terrence?
50 million? I don't remember.
We have a number of other guests this evening, and I was hoping to get them all in, or we want to get everybody in. Jack McCarthy is a member of the retirement board, longtime member of the retirement board. Sitting with him is our chief assessor, Tony DeLude. We also have our auditor, who, Tanya, do you get a vote on the retirement board, just as auditor? You get a vote on the retirement board, right? And Cheryl Dugray, we all know. Cheryl, does your position as the director of retirement, does your position still get a vote, or you just tell them what they're doing and how to do it, right? Okay. And our city treasurer, Sandra. Sandy, you don't get a vote, but you work very closely with the board, and which is something that's important to us. In a moment, we're going to get to our superintendent of the gas and electric, because I know Jim is gracious enough not just to come down, but does have some interest. And obviously, pension obligation bonds can, if we ever went the route, can be used in different ways, and risk would change in different scenarios. But Bellamy, before we get to that, we're also joined by our Ward 3 Councilor, Dave Bartley, and City Councilor at Large, Rebecca Lisi. Councilors, we're trying to get this done by 7 o'clock, so charter and rules can take off right at 7 o'clock. So we've agreed to do all the questions and to get the answers that we want, and to try to get the best understanding we can of a somewhat complicated issue with a lot to think about. Bellamy, before we get any further, is there more to the presentation? I know there's a number, not just Brockton, but there's a number of communities listed here that have done pension obligation bonds.
Well, there are only 3 that have done pension obligation. There are some that have enabling legislation like us, but haven't done a bond. So there are only 3 that have done bonds, and of the 3, one is de minimis, Drake. There was only 2 million. So, but the 2 that really did pension obligations are Brockton, which we've talked about, which was a negative experience, and Worcester, which also was a negative experience, because in both cases, they issued pension obligation bonds within a year or 2 before a market crash. So the experience in Massachusetts has not been splendid, shall we say. And the data's all there, and I'm not going to go through it.
Okay. Cheryl or Tanya, Sandy, is there anything you wanted to add, or just going to be available for questions? Okay. Jack, good. Tony, good at the moment. If the committee, before we get into more questions and answers, Jim, would you like to share some thoughts about the gas and electrics position?
Just here for education more than anything.
That's fine. That's what we're all here for. Yeah. I just didn't want to, because you're here, I just wanted to make sure if you are interested, we'd love to hear from you. Then we will open up to question and answers. Questions anyways.
So,
Councilor Sullivan.
you want?
Councilor Tallman?
Yeah, just briefly, thanks, Cinda, for coming down again and trying to get us understanding the different financial situations that we're in right now. You stated earlier about the city of Holyoke, it may not be able to have the backing. Can you sort of explain that? You know, basically our credit, you know, our bonds, and our bonds are our fund, the stabilization, and, you know, that this would be a difficult thing for Holyoke to get through? You know, overall financial picture.
I think it would be a difficult thing for Holyoke to get through. I think that the expectation from both the rating agency, from both Moody's and Standard & Poor's and Fitch, for that matter, which are the 3 primary rating agencies for municipal bonds. There's some others, but those are the 3. Moody's and Standard & Poor's are basically the only 2 that do Massachusetts. I think that they would be looking to see, you know, they'd be evaluating in the process of looking at the city taking on this kind of risk, they'd be looking at the management of the city, and they'd be taking a look at whether or not, they've got very elaborate ways that they evaluate management these days, and they've got a scoring metric of whether or not there's a multi-year forecasting taking place, whether or not they're of operations, whether or not there's a capital plan, and whether or not the debt financing of that capital plan fits into the multi-year forecast, whether or not all the enterprise activities are self-supporting, whether or not you have fiscal policies for every kind of thing that they look at metrics for, whether or not you've evaluated how much debt you can afford, whether or not you've evaluated how quickly debt should amortize, whether or not you've evaluated how much debt per capita that you're willing to spend, whether or not the willingness of the city to do debt exclusions. The city hasn't had a debt exclusion, or have you? Did you ever have a debt exclusion? No. No. So,
We
was
did-
there one was there an override? Yeah, so there was an override. When was that? I can't remember. Was it
We
a long-
did attempt,
91 and 92?
What did you do?
we did attempt a debt exclusion prior to the override that passed. The override we passed in there, and I remember you telling us how illegal it was the menu one, where we put it
Yeah.
out in questions as a menu.
Well, how long ago was that?
That was 1992. It was a
92.
special election in June, which I'll never forget, because some good guy got beat for mayor
91,
that same election.
Mr. History, 91. You beat me on my birthday.
Terry and I were in the same ballot.
So they would be evaluated, so the management as a percent of the rating is 20% of the rating. And that combined with financial performance. So, they look at whether or not you're structurally balanced, whether or not your revenues exceed your expenditures each year. They look at how much of they look at your budget flexibility, how much is in the stabilization fund, how much do you have in the general fund, unassigned fund balance, or free cash. They take a look at that. So they're evaluating, in connection with this, at this point, OPEB has become a big topic. Is there any plan for OPEB? If the idea was pension was going to be used for something other than OPEB, then there's still, if you look at the last credit report, they're concerned about the unfunded, even though the system's performing better, they look at, they're concerned about the level of unfunded pension and unfunded OPEB already. They're not particularly concerned about the city's debt, of regular debt, but they look at debt, pension, and OPEB altogether. And that is not, that they kind of ding you if there's no real plan for OPEB. You've got a plan for pension right now because you are funding it on a schedule that would take it out, and it's aggressive by 2032. But they, the management score, and that one really comes into play with regard to taking on risk, is evaluating what's going on with the management and what the policies and practices are of the city. And there's, I think that's an opportunity for the city currently, without considering POBs, to strengthen its credit, is to develop all those things I just mentioned, and to work on those, and to give that a lot of attention. Whether or not there's an opportunity for a POB, I think, without feeling like the management was stellar. So they rank everything. They rank these categories, the local economy and they rank everything 1 to 5. Without having a 1 in management, it's hard to believe that both the rating agencies and even the state would have some concern about the city of Holyoke necessarily taking on this risk, unless they could unless they could understand that the effort was stellar to evaluate it. I think that they would want that, and I would think the city would want that. I would, as a taxpayer, I'd want that.
Thank you.
Councilor Leahy.
Yeah, thank you, Bellamy, and also Cinder, thank you both for this education. This is something, obviously, is very important to go over. And I also want to thank Michael Sullivan for always thinking outside the box and trying to think of different ways to save money, and trying to do this so it would offset the cost of a different project. But having said all that, Cinder, just very quickly, in your professional opinion, is this a good thing for the city of Holyoke to do, or is it not a good thing for the city of Holyoke to do?
Like I said, without,
Just a yes or no type of thing.
probably no.
Okay, thank you.
If we could get back, a question about the gas and, not the gas and electric specific, but the 13 years where we're getting to be fully funded and to finally, address, as we're addressing our unfunded liability. if the city were to go to any pension obligation bond, is the commitment on the annual basis go away in terms of paying off the unfunded liability? Or do we still have to pay that off as we go?
Say that again, if you issue the bond, you funded the pension system.
Well, if it wasn't a bond for the full amount.
No, then you still owe the amortization on the part that you didn't bond.
We still have to keep paying.
So you would now pay the regular ongoing contribution, you'd pay the part that you didn't bond, and you'd pay the debt service on the bond, which now would be fixed. To the extent that you borrowed at, say, your assumption is you're gonna earn 7.5, I think, something like that. And if you borrow at 5, then the idea is that, so say that 1 year you don't earn 5, because that's what you really need to meet now, is the 5%. Anything over 5% is gravy, but say that there's a year where you have a down year like with the recession, minus 25% for 2 years in a row. Say that's the experience. You have to, if you're doing smoothing or however you're calculating the amortization, you have to recalculate the amortization of what now is the unfunded pension liability. And in addition to paying the debt service on the pension obligation bond, you have to start paying an additional piece to fund the new unfunded pension liability that got created. Now, you wouldn't have had that new amount had you not had more assets in your hand. You would have only lost on the amount of assets you had. So that's the additional risk that comes if you have pension obligation bonds too. So now you've got more money to make and more money to lose. So that everything becomes augmented.
Right, but in 13 years, we're gonna be in that position anyways, the next
13
recession,
years,
because
if
it'll
you
be a
don't
fully
make-
funded.
Yeah, well, if you don't make 7.5% in the next 13 years, then you won't be fully funded, right? Because you're assuming you're gonna make 7.5%, and that's the way that you backed into the calculation of the 118 million that's unfunded. I mean, that's because of the value of your assets. So if you earn 11%, then you're way over what you're doing, and you'll either fund it sooner than 13 years. But if you earn less, it goes both ways. That's what the state wanted to see. They wanted to see good experience too. What happens if it's good? And they looked at that. They wanted to see the history of the retirement system assets. Go back to the last 20 years. What has been the experience for Holyoke? What was your experience during the recession? They would probably want to go back to before and during and after the recession.
Cheryl, if I could ask you a quick question at the mic. Sorry, but because we have an audience watching at home, and we have to make sure we're all on the system. What we're talking about, do we have a schedule? I'm guessing from what Cinder just explained, it's a moving target of what the city's going to be paying over the next 5 years. And is that something you can make available to us, or if not this evening, at any near? Well, that'd be helpful. Yeah, I mean, is it self-explanatory? It's,
Effective 1/1/2018. That's the evaluation done then. Developed that schedule. So when we do it again for 1/1/20, it'll change.
okay. But we're $300,000 range and growing, safe to say?
I think for 2020 and for 2021, I think it's the same amount. That we were able to keep it at the same amount because we had a very good experience in 2017, not so bad in 2016. So how that will change, so those. I know it is. And it will be because I've wanted to keep it flat for 5 years. Where it will go up right now, but who knows? Depends on how we do. So far, so good.
And any predictions on the market?
It looks pretty good right now. At the end of March, we were up 8.7%, so that's good. 2018 was not so which considering we're supposed to get 7.5, is like losing 12.
And I don't want to,
We'll have a good year, but this one, that will smooth it out.
and I don't want to put words in your mouth or into the retirement board itself, and certainly not asking this evening to look for it, but in general, is the board happy with this schedule in terms of, I don't know what it's called, a safer route, but it's a route that has an end to it, an end to the unfunded liability?
You have to turn your mic
Or
on.
do they see any merit in, all of a sudden, poof, we borrow it, give it to you, and with risk, with major risk, I guess. Well, let's start over. On the market predictions.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't know. I would not like to see the schedule go any further out than 2032. I'd like to decrease it, definitely. And we have tried to do that every time that we do evaluation and we have some spare money where we had a great return. What we try to do is reduce the 7.5%. When we started funding back in fiscal 90, it was 8.5%. So over time, we have reduced it to 7.5. But when you do that, you have to have a cushion because it costs. So I'd love to see it get down to 7%, and I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Okay. And I'm our administrative assistant who's listening right now in a little room over here like the Wizard of Oz. He's going to make copies of this, Ryan, for everybody. Please. Not tonight, but for the future. Mike?
So Cheryl, I'm going to put you on the spot like Counselor Leahy did over here.
Okay.
The retirement board, are you in favor, is the board in favor of going the next step or pursuing this any further, or have you reached a conclusion on this?
I think we're scared to death.
Okay.
We're kind of conservative.
Yep.
So kind of the risk,
That-
in my opinion, now I can really am
Those
not
words are
speaking
not
for
in
them.
Jack McCarthy's
No.
vocabulary. I know
That would be me.
But I also know he's
I
been
don't
very
vote.
conservative with his position. How many years now? No idea.
He's been on the board since 2001.
2001?
Our ship is sailing pretty smooth, I don't think we should do anything.
And who do we go to for the investments now? Is it still
We have our chief investment officer is Ray DePelto.
still Ray? Okay. Ray is a former, a former retirement board director and, came out of the treasurer's office at one time, or like, no? So, yeah,
I don't know.
okay. You all set for a moment?
Yep.
Counselor Lacey?
Thank
Cheryl,
you. I
thanks.
actually don't have a question for Cheryl.
Oh,
I'm gonna,
okay.
I mean, either Cheryl or Sindra may be able to answer this. So I hear all parties here talking about there's a very high risk in the pension obligation bonds, and yet, from what I understand, both our retirement board and the pension obligation fund, they're investing in the market. So why is there so much more risk in the pension obligation plan? Is it because you're investing in part in Parex, state fund, or?
I don't think that's, I believe it's because if the market turns sour, whether we had our money in the PRIT fund or investing it on our own, you create more unfunded liability that you have to pay off.
Because we're
plus
freezing up.
you're paying the bond.
Because we're freezing up a portion of our, I guess, liquidity in some sense, or our cash flow is being.
No, because the way the scheduling is set up is that the whole schedule assumes we're getting 7.5% to keep it funded. But if we don't get 7.5%, that means the asset goes down, so the difference between what you need in your fund and what you have creates an unfunded liability that now has to be amortized, but you're still paying the bond. So it increases, so you're paying two things.
Okay.
Do I have that right?
Yeah, and so just, in terms of the example that you just gave, in terms of last year, we were under 4%, and now we're trying to catch up.
Right.
So not only in the pension obligation bond scenario, if the market did that same underperforming at the 4% rate, not only would we have to catch up the same amount that we do this year, but then we also have a
loss
debt
from the
service to
exactly.
pay off.
Exactly.
Okay.
Can I add to that answer?
Oh, sure.
Because so right now you're investing 228 million, is that the amount of the?
280.
So 283 in system assets. Let's just say you would basically borrow another 100 million to take the risk of investing.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. I mean, it was basically, would you go to the bank and borrow $50,000 and go invest it in the stock market? I mean, that is what needs to be evaluated. You know, it's basically, you know, it's a permissible arbitrage play, but you're putting the city's credit at risk in the process.
Counselor, all set?
Thank you.
Counselor McGee.
All right. Thank you, and thank you for everyone coming down, and you as well. I know you had to travel far. Several years back, then President Jourdain invited me into a meeting in the mayor's office to discuss this exact same thing. And back then, it scared the heck out of me because of the risk. And then it popped its head up again, and there was comments that the risk had shifted, and I said, oh, that's interesting. So my intent was to bring everyone in, not to be behind closed doors anymore, but to get it out into the public, to actually understand what a pension obligation bond is. We did a tutorial of it, but really is you are taking money, a loan, to then fill and then try and invest and see if that loan will help pay off everything. It's a nice trick, and I'm not downplaying it. If market goes well, you can do well by it. But I've always had a very big concern about this. I know Kevin and I debated it, and Kevin kind of liked it. I always shied away from it. But I wanted you in here to hear these concerns and get it out into the public, because the problems are when we get the phone calls, well, there's no risk anymore. I heard from Bob Smith or whoever, and everything's fine. And, you know, it's just me counteracting, saying, I think it's bad. Well, now I have the information that I think the public needed to hear as to it is an option. It's an option that has to be explored. Probably not the best option, but it's an option. So I appreciate you coming down and actually giving us the information that we need to get back to the public, so that way we can answer the questions, not just on our own. In essence, just my comments. So I appreciate you coming down and actually helping me give me the ammunition I need. Thanks.
I'm going to recognize Counselor Sullivan, but ask a quick question to everybody, all our guests in the audience. Thank you, Cheryl. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add, or do you have your own questions while we have Cinder here and while we have Bellamy here? And, you know, I think we've gotten to a point where we're just down to questions. And so I appreciate everyone coming in this evening, because I think it's important. And I think even from the different perspective of gas and electric, you know, this is an opening discussion for some things and perhaps a closing discussion for others. We're not sure. But at this point, we'll continue with questions. And we're doing pretty good with time, Mr. Chairman. So I think you should be proud of us. And I learned this from Councilor Bartley and how he runs DGR. You know, it's like you just keep it going forward, you know. Councilor Sullivan.
Yeah. So I want to echo what Councilor McGee just said. And also I wanted to make certain that as we went down this road towards debt exclusion is make sure it's the only way to finance these new schools, that no rock was left unturned and there were no other alternatives available to us that we hadn't explored or looked at. Having said that, you alluded earlier on that we had some other things, and if it's okay with the chairman, if we've got some time to move on to discuss the financing of the schools.
Do you want to do that now?
I'm ready if the rest of the committee.
I want to keep with the open meeting law and keep with the gist of what we've posted here. I understand that one of the reasons we're looking at pension obligation, only maybe just one, but there are multiple ones, was to fund the middle schools. If we can keep it focused on why we should or shouldn't use pension obligation bond to fund the middle school project, that's fine. But, you know, keep it in the narrow perimeter.
Well, I don't know how narrow this is, but,
Use your imagination.
yeah.
Fines start at $2,000.
The, the check's in the mail.
Well, one of the things, I can keep it within the context of the pension obligation bond. I mean, if someone threw out the idea that the pension obligation bond could save $5 million, I don't know you know, we'd have to analyze that, but, $5 million isn't going to pay for $50 million worth of schools. And the $5 million might not come in until year 13, or it might not come in, it might come in small amounts and wouldn't do much to sort of offset the cost of what is being proposed for the school construction projects, from what I gather. But it's also back to what I said before, it doesn't really fit into, I think that the school construction bonds needs to be paid for with something that's a real revenue, ongoing revenue stream coming into the city, whether it's property taxes that are not subject to a debt exclusion or a debt exclusion. And I think when you do look at the numbers that we bring, when we get focused on that, you'll see what, you know, we looked at what the capacity is for the city to afford additional debt under the lower levy limit of Prop 2.5, which there really is no capacity. You know, it's the reason why you've done what you've done with sewer rates, and there's really no capacity there. So it's, you know, it's not a great plan. The pension obligation bond, from my perspective, but I think also the rating agency perspective, which is where my perspective comes from a lot of the times, is to what protects the city's credit, is the pension obligation bond can't be linked to, you know, becoming some kind of the source of payment for something else that you need to do. You know, the problem is that if you issue debt, so here you have a source of payment that's not necessarily coming in, and you've got and then you've got a debt. You've issued a debt to provide maybe the source, and then you've issued another debt that, you know, it gets so complicated. It's like almost like a house of cards. I mean, I think that's how the rating agency could start looking at that as the plan to pay for the school. But there's only, if the savings was $5 million, say the saving, you know, that's, in a way, that's a drop in the bucket on a $50 million construction project plus interest.
Well, it's the cost, as I've been told, is, depending on what numbers we arrive at, is in the neighborhood of $3.5 million a year would be the cost of servicing that. So
Oh, did somebody suggest that the savings was $5 million a year?
Right.
Oh, well, I don't know where those numbers are coming from. But even if you know, that would have to be proven before and set aside. And the problem with that is if you use it for something besides a buffer for down years, I mean, you really don't know the reality of what a pension obligation bond will produce until 2032. You don't even know if you can amortize the pension by 2032 at this point. But if you know, you've got to, you know, you won't have the real experience. That's only, I know it's only 13 years away, but in a way you'd have to wait until quite into that to figure out what you've really been able to accomplish.
Okay, so the two other questions I have that I feel are still integral to this order, right, if you could answer them, are on a debt exclusion override.
Yep.
All right, could a debt exclusion override be done on a residential basis only and not include the commercial rate? Do you know the answer to that?
No, I don't know the exact answer. I'm thinking about how that could get done. It would,
I've been told that other cities have done it. I've asked several times
it
from the
would be
building
easy enough
committee.
to
but
get an answer on that.
Is
but it would
Tony
probably
still here?
triple what the cost is to the residents.
Tony's like, where's Waldo? He never sits still.
I don't know the exact, I'm not sure. I don't want to just guess at that.
Right.
But it would probably, because we brought commercial tax impact and residential tax impact, we brought that information with us, and I'm guessing it would probably triple the residential impact to do that. When you see the numbers that we brought, I don't think that, you know, I might be wrong, but I don't think that the tax impact is that high. You know, on a monthly basis, it's less than any resident, the average resident pays for, you know, basic services of things like, you know, telephone.
I agree on the residential part. The
Well, even
commercial
the
part,
commercial is not that much higher. When you see those numbers, I think you're, pardon?
It's
Well,
twice the
for-
amount per thousand.
I know, but if it's 100, if it's, you know, so, well, I don't know when you want to look at the numbers, so it's easier to just look at all the numbers together, and and you can see what, if, you know, get your reaction to what you see.
but I guess we don't have time for
If
that.
if I could just, Tony, I'm not sure if you
Yeah,
have this
yeah.
answer either, but Mike, just ask,
You can just do it just for residential. I think the override would have to be for the whole city.
I'm not trying to put you too much on the spot, Tony, but you're telling me you think, or you're not, we're still not sure of the,
Almost positive it's for the whole city.
One way to do it would be to shift
You're shifting
toward the
already
tax,
anyways.
residential base.
We're already shifting anyways.
Yeah, so you just shift more,
Commercial.
and then you accomplish what you're talking about.
Just change the way it shift.
Yeah, just would make it consistent, so then you just shift to the residential base.
okay, and
But
so
interest
what,
rates are so low that if they don't, if we, you know, if interest rates are low now and they're anticipated to stay low for a while, so I think that opens up a lot of other options for the city to consider too, if there's a debt exclusion.
I mean, debt exclusion and overrides are for the whole city. So how can you discriminate against one group, commercial or residential? So that's,
but it's just that
I don't think you
everything I've
can.
heard is anecdotal.
I'll have that answer tomorrow though, for sure,
Yep.
in cement.
I had heard that other cities had done it, that it couldn't be done for Proposition 2.5, but that it could be done on a debt.
There are some communities like Boston which have a residential factor because the values are so high, they want people to still live in their homes. So they'll exclude so much money, like the first 700,000 for houses that are, you know, between 5 and 6 million. So they would just be able to keep their houses instead of selling them to commercial or industrial, whatever, you know, whatever, who would buy it, you know. So that was just to keep the homeowners in the city of Boston. So you have some exclusions, and that's an exclusion for, we had talked about it back in the 90s for, you know, moving the tax rate or giving residential homeowners a break on that, you know, just on the regular tax rate. So it would almost be like the CPA where we have the first 100,000 for everything. So residential, you could have a residential exclusion just for the first 100,000 on, you know, on a regular tax rate.
Okay.
Tony, is the debt exclusion, sorry, Mike, I was asked this question, I keep forgetting to get an answer to it. I think I know the answer, but was if a debt exclusion passes, is it tied to the value of property, or is it tied to the amount for what the debt exclusion is in a set amount?
The amount is tied to your value, so
So it could
you would have
change.
your value, we would add it as a line item, it's almost like a bill. So it'd be almost like a line item on the recap sheet for debt exclusion, but it goes factored into all the values for the
So
city.
each year it's a
Yeah.
moving target, just
Yeah.
like property tax and
That's
just like,
correct.
okay, thank you, sorry.
But you could shift, you know, toward the commercial rate, shift it toward the residential if that was something that the city wanted to do.
Yeah, okay, so, then my last question, so if we did a debt exclusion override, we're looking at funding $55 million. Where does that leave our bond rating, and do we have the ability to even do that?
I think you could do that. I think that, you know, if it's not under the lower levy limit and it's a debt exclusion, you're raising it above so you can tax it over and above the constrained levy cap, then I think you can do that. And it shows a willingness on the part of the city because they want the projects, and it's, you know, it reflects a lot of positive things from an outside perspective. You know, from the rating agency perspective, it shows that the city's willing to pay for what it wants. It shows that the city's not trying to fit it underneath a cap that there's no room, where the city's gonna have other kinds of things competing for what amount of flexibility it can create under that lower cap. You know,
So the effect on our bond rating would be positive, neutral, or negative?
Neutral. It's not positive first, it's neutral. The kinds of things that would have a positive effect are creating fiscal policies and a capital plan and forward
Yep.
evaluation. And then performance. And the economy.
Okay.
Okay, for a minute.
Yep.
Counselor Bacon?
Thank you. Hi, thanks for coming down. My question goes to more general statements that you've made, I think, each time I've heard you speak and in each report I've seen. And it's around the need for a financial plan and fiscal reform in the city. And so if you could share with us for how long you have been recommending that the city actually make a plan and have forecasting as part of our budgeting and engage in some fiscal reforms so that we can fund for our debt, because we know we have future obligations that we must fund. And currently, we're spending up to the cap in our current budget. We have other obligations coming down the road. So I'm interested to understand how long you've been recommending that we develop a fiscal plan. And if the loan, to your point, if the citizens, first, the city council has to basically stipulate to the citizens that we feel that it won't hurt the city by voting to put it on the ballot. I'm not convinced of that because I'm hearing credit reports that say we don't have the management that is creating confidence, and that we're at a A bond rating, whereas if we were going to seek bonding, we would need to be AAA. And
No.
well, for the pension bond, you said that the cities that received the approval went in at AAA rating.
No. Brockton was not a AAA. No, the state had different conditions
At that
depending upon
time.
the credit.
Okay, so that's not a general statement, that was just that situation.
They wouldn't allow, if you were AAA, you could structure the bonds on pension obligation bonds to take savings sooner.
Okay.
If you were lower credit, you had to wait to prove
Okay.
yourself with the savings
Okay,
for a longer period of time because of, the assumption about what a lower credit, it's kind of like.
okay, I hear you on that, but my question is really more to the general point of the financial planning and the fiscal reform in the city. If the city council is to vote to go forward seeking bond exclusion in terms of fiscal responsibility and accountability, it seems that you've been making recommendations for a number of years that the city would be getting its arms around fiscal management in a stronger way than we have to date. I mean, we keep hearing that we're going to do that in any number of meetings,
Well, I think the city continues to improve.
Cinder, do you mind using your microphone just a bit more so we get your full voice?
Sure, the city continues to improve. I don't want to give the impression that the city's not improving all the time, and it has been for years and years. It's light years ahead of where it was a long time ago, as are most cities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This is a really, then the city's dealing with things that, less rapid growth opportunities than other parts of the state have had. The city's has done a really good job of building its financial position. But that alone is not enough to give it a AAA rating. It's got demographics that are lower than what higher ratings might be. It's managing itself well within the constraints of lack of new growth. Cities can always improve, and they've been growing by leaps and bounds. Everybody's learned a lot about financial management practices in the last 10 years. The city's had a lot of policies. They haven't been necessarily adopted by the city council at this point. I'm not sure the city council would be ready to adopt fiscal policies until it does a full analysis of what it needs. It takes time. It's kind of like, Rome wasn't built in a day. A community, the conversation around fiscal policy starts, and then everybody needs to slowly but surely embrace the idea of creating fiscal policies. And a lot of times people don't necessarily agree about what the fiscal policy ought to be, and certainly doesn't agree about let's put it in writing, because once you put it in writing, you have to adhere to it. And if you don't adhere to it, you don't get credit for it, and in fact, you might get negative credit for it. But the city's got plenty of market access. I mean, the city is well above non-investment grade credit. Non-investment grade credit would be below a BAA. I mean, there aren't even any.
Yes, and there's been a number of us who've been very strongly guarding the stabilization fund.
Yep.
To lead us to.
And I think that's the one thing that the city has been really faithful to guarding that. I think that's been a really good thing, and that's what's held the city. The city is viewed as having credibility for having done that. What the city just did with regard to raising I think it was the sewer rates, so that the sewer can be self-supporting, that's viewed as very positive. That would be viewed as fiscally a prudent step. And that took a long time to come, and that's something that now the city can share that with the rating agency, that they've accomplished that. And that's another step under it, another accomplishment under its belt. There's lots of things like that as the city's ready to sort of take on looking at all the fiscal policies. But a lot of the municipalities around the state right now are all looking at sort of plagiarizing each other's fiscal policies, but deciding what makes sense for the city. The city has a financial, for the debt that's not it's currently looking at developing a plan for possibly 2 new schools. But it's got a financial plan for the schools for the debt that's currently authorized but not yet issued. It's got a debt model that it's been using and following in connection with that debt.
I think we're waiting to see that in finance. I think Ton is going to present that to us shortly. But thank you for that. And but my point is, and I hear your point from the fiscal analysis perspective, that the money's coming in to pay for these certain expense categories. From the citizens' point of view, they're feeling it and seeing it and responding to it differently, because they're seeing a CPA tax, a big sewer rate increase, the property values are going up. That's a happy thing, but their taxes also go up. So their experience in the last year has been increase, while they are looking at 0 increase to their income, or maybe 2%. In the average salary increase. So I take your points from like the macro view, but in the city, that is what the recent immediate experience has been, and the feedback is that. So just to put it in the other frame, if you would. Thank you.
Chair is going to be pushing into a 2-minute warning. I just want to recognize Councilor Murphy because his hand is up.
Yeah, just quick thought, and first of all, I did a little reading before we ever talked about this to kind of get an idea, and I know the Government Finance Officers Association really cautions people to go into pension obligation bonds, but if we were to do it, if we were to put out pension obligation bonds for the full 139, would we be paying that over a 20-year period? And if so, in terms of annual budget, what difference would that make for the city?
Well, so right now you'd pay it, the standard would be that you would structure it to be finally paid, the bond, by 2032, so that it parallels what you're currently doing. If you extend it out longer, you're going to cut into the savings. Okay. And the longer out you go, I don't think you could go beyond 2040, and that would be a question, but I don't think you can go beyond 2040 because you have to amortize that unfunded pension by state law by 2040. But it's the same thing as what Cheryl was just saying. The retirement board has expressed not wanting to go past 2032. You basically would mirror what you've got. Okay. And you would provide savings that were at least equal every year, but the problem is if you try to front load the savings, you have to do that by backloading the payback on the bonds, and it cuts into how much you can save because it's going to cost you more interest to backload that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank everyone for their presentation and being here this evening to answer the questions. A special thank you to Bellamy and Cinder for making the initial presentation to give us everything we need to know about pension obligation bonds, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I guess, is a good way to put it. This has been very informative. Chair will note that the City Council cannot initiate any pension obligation bond, but certainly we are more knowledgeable if one was ever to come our way, and if we ever had the purpose of exploring it or acting on one, we would we would be much more in better position. So with that in mind, the chair thinks there's a perfect motion. I think the maker
I'll
of
make
the
a
order-
motion to have it complied with.
Motion made and seconded that this order has been complied with. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? It's 1 minute before 7. Finance Committee is about to adjourn. We will be in about 2 to 3 minutes, be hearing from the Charter and Rules Committee, which will be taking over.
I make a motion to adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? We stand adjourned.
With a minute to spare.